I hate to make a mistake. And what's even worse is when somebody else knows that you've made a mistake. I just hate making mistakes. The other day I sent a thank you note to somebody who had done some proofing for me on a project, and they quickly texted me back pictures of all the grammatical errors I made in that thank you note. Just dumb stuff, like I put like an S where an A should have been. Most intelligent people wouldn't do that. But I hate to make a mistake, and I know I'm not alone here in this room. I know that statistically, that the number one fear of us guys, is failure. We don't want to fail. We don't want to mess up. We don't want to make a mistake, and we definitely don't want anybody to know if we fail or mess up or make a mistake. The problem is we all make mistakes. We all do it. And sometimes we can get this idea in our head that's the culmination of our mistakes that somehow begins to define who we are. And what I want you to know this morning, what I tell my kids and I want to tell you, is it's not your mistake that defines who you are. It's who you decide to be after you've made the mistake that defines who you are. And so this morning, I want to talk about mistakes. And we all make mistakes, and the problem with mistakes is mistakes are easy to make. Now, I want to share a story with you in the Bible, and I don't think this story is preached on often. I don't think this shows up in many sermons. It's about a guy we've been kind of talking about here or there in sermons for the last few months, a guy named David. Killed a giant. He goes off the fields. He's a man after God's own heart. And when this story takes place, David is at the pinnacle of his career. He is king over Israel. Things are going good, and he makes a huge mistake. So let's just jump into the text. If you've got the Harborside app, go ahead. You're going to want to open that now and follow along with the sermon notes. If you don't have it, you can download it onto your device, and we're going to follow along with the scriptures and the notes for this message. And we're going to start with 1 Chronicles chapter 21, where it says, Satan rose up against Israel, and he incited David to take a census of Israel. Now, if anybody could say the devil made me do it, perhaps David could in this scenario. Satan rises up against him and incites him. Maybe a better interpretation of the Hebrew word that's used there would be entices or tempts David. And Satan goes after David in a particular way for a particular sin that David is already bent towards. In other words, I could ask you a question this morning. It would be, what is your signature sin? What's your signature sin? In his book, The Me I Want to Be, author John Ortberg, he pulls out this kind of terminology, this idea that there's all these sins we're tempted by, but each one of us has one or two just signature sins that we're kind of pre-bent towards. It would be like this. If Satan wanted to destroy your life within 5 minutes, what sin would he use for you? It may be different for each person in the room, but we know that we're kind of bent towards this one. This is kind of our go-to. This is the one that could ruin our life like that if we were to give into it right now. And so for David, he has this signature sin, and Satan goes right for it. Now, we can look at the text and we can go, well, what's the big deal about a census? What's the big deal about counting people? I mean, we could come up with way worse sins in here if we took the time. A census doesn't sound so bad. And so let's put some context to this verse. You see, it's been 400 years that Israel has been at war. They've been fighting for the promised land that God has given them. They've been fighting to become their own nation. And at this point in history, through the kingship of David, they have expanded their borders. They have solidified their borders. They are the most powerful and the wealthiest nation of the ancient world at that time. And God has done it through the kingship of David. So David wants to take a census. Why? They're at peace. See, if you're going to count people, you're counting them to go, oh, well, I want to know if we wanted to go to war tomorrow, how many troops if I just snap my fingers, how many troops could we just go into battle right there? How powerful is our army? If I just wanted to collect some money, if I just wanted to go for some tax dollars with the census, how much money, how wealthy am I, is what David's saying. How powerful am I? I want to know. And the problem is David all of a sudden has taken the peace that God has given him in the land, and he's trying to go, well, I just want to know how big I am. And I want to count. I want a number attached to this. And so the sin that David's already pre-bent towards is self-sufficiency or pride, which pulls him away from God's will. In fact, there's this quote from Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. Says, "There's only one vice of which no man in the world is free. The more we have it in ourselves, the more we dislike it in others. The vice I am talking of is pride or self-conceit. Unchastity, anger, greed, drunkenness, all that, they're just mere flea bites in comparison. It was through pride that the devil became the devil, and pride leads to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind." And we know for David, he's bent towards pride. He wants to know what a big deal he is and what a great job he's done as king. In fact, we know that David's got some good friends around him. One of the friends, his name is Joab. He's the commander of David's army. And Joab kind of risks his life to say, "Hey, David, I heard you want to take a census. Please do not do that. That's going to be a sin. Please don't take the census." But what the passage tells us is that the king, David, well, he insisted that they take the census anyway. And so to count all these people, it takes close to about 10 months to count everybody up, and it takes a lot of taxpayer dollars. And at the end of it, David is given the results. He has at his ready about 1 million military troops ready for battle. Now, just to give you a picture of what that means, if you were to count up all the 5 branches of the United States of America's military right now and how many troops we have ready for battle right now, the number would be right around 1 million troops. David has 1 million troops back then. We have about 1 million troops right now, and we consider ourselves a pretty big superpower. That's how big his army was. And then the wealth is huge. And I believe it's right about this point. David's about to feast on the results of the census. But then the verse tells us God was very displeased with the census, and he punished Israel for it. Now, if I could just pause this story in the Bible for a second, I'd like to share with you another story. It's a story that happened to me a little over a month ago. I was preparing for the sermon, the message that I would have to preach before this one. And it's interesting, in the preparation for that sermon, it gave me a story for this sermon. If you'll let me, I just want to kind of pull back the curtain for a second and give you a little insight and a little, just an opportunity to see how and why we do this whole teaching, preaching, pastor thing here at Harborside. You see, we have a senior pastor named Kurt Parker, but he isn't the teaching pastor every Sunday. And there's several reasons why we've built up a team of teaching and preaching pastors. One of those reasons is that there's studies that show that a 30-minute sermon, preaching a 30-minute sermon is somewhere around the emotional expenditure equivalent of a 1 8-hour workday. So if you think about it, by the time Kurt has preached 4 messages on a Sunday, he's already spent himself emotionally for the week. He's done. And so we want to be careful about that. In fact, it was several years ago that I went to a church that's about 4 times our size. And at the time, they had 6 services happening. And I noticed that their senior pastor, he only preached a max of 2 of those 6 services. In fact, I found out it was a rule that the elders had placed upon the senior pastor. And I asked the staff, I said, what's the deal? You got 6 services. The senior pastor only preaches 2. They said, oh, yeah, that's a rule. I said, well, why? They said, well, because he just got out of the hospital. They said he was preaching 4 of those every week, and it put him in the hospital several months because it just about killed him. So if it's okay with you, I'd like to keep Kurt alive just a little longer and let him catch his breath now and then. And so we don't want that, but there's actually an even bigger, more important reason why we build up teams of teaching and preaching pastors. It's because the opportunity we have to raise up more and more teaching and preaching pastors, to raise up the next generation so that the gospel message can go beyond the walls of this church and go beyond the lifetimes of teachers and preachers. And so we see a grand opportunity that our mission is bigger than just what we do here in Safety Harbor. It has ramifications for the rest of the world and the gospel message to the rest of the world through more and more teaching and preaching pastors who get to build those skills and do this. And so we're excited, and that's what we do. And so the last couple of years, Kurt and I, we've kind of talked about, well, how do we get better at this? What kind of systems can we put into place? How can we do this well and keep getting better at doing this? And so one of the things we put in place is that anybody who hits the stage Sunday morning to preach, or Sunday night, 2 weeks before they preach, they meet with me. And so I sit down with Ethan, I sit down with Tom Bates, I sit down with Amos and Griffin, and we look at their message, and we look at it, and we kind of, I try to pull out, okay, this is really strong, this is not so strong. In fact, we'll kind of build a new structure or get a good organization of it in the text, and the guys will joke that I'll cut about 50% of their message. But they have 2 weeks to get over it, all right? So they have 2 weeks to catch their breath. They're like, Tom's a jerk, but anyway, and we'll, so anyway, so they'll work on it, and they'll come back with a better product. And that's 2 weeks before. And then 5 days before they have to preach on this stage, they have to come into this room, onto this stage, and you guys are a really nice audience, but that Tuesday before they preach, it's filled with all the preaching pastors who are sitting down there taking notes. You guys are a nice audience. That's a tough audience. A bunch of guys who do this already, and they're ready to critique you on how well you do. And because it's 5 days before, we have a couple rules. And so the teaching pastor will preach before the Sunday. He'll preach on the stage, and then he'll go ahead and take a break out there. The teaching pastors will deliberate, and they'll invite them back in. And the rule is this: we're going to tell them 10 things they did right. All right? 10 things. We want them to repeat what they did right, and we want them to know this is good. And we will tell them a max of 2 things that they need to just tweak, just lightly change, and it'll just help their sermon get that much bigger. Because they don't have a lot of time. They only got 5 days before they got to preach that. And we want them to be encouraged. We want them to just get a little something to sharpen them. And so that's the process we use. So it was a little over a month ago that it was my turn. I knew I had a trip to Italy. That was another year, Israel. But I had a trip to Italy planned, and I'd be gone for a while. So I worked months before that trip to prepare a message, because I knew I'd be getting right back from Italy, and I'd have to hit the stage and preach. And so I'd worked months before that. I loved this text. I always wanted to preach on this particular text. I built this whole message. I loved it. It was great, and I think it was. But then I came back, and it was Tuesday. And the problem was, I'd gone to Italy, and I had all these stories and these new things I learned, and I thought, no problem. I'm just going to take these stories, take what I learned. I'm pretty good at this preaching thing. I'm going to integrate it into my existing sermon. Yeah, they're 2 different topics and ideas or whatever, but I'm good at this. I can they're not going to know. And so I put this together, intricately wove them together, and thought this is going to be fantastic. Standing ovation when I'm done, I'm sure, and it'll be great. And so it's Tuesday afternoon, and all the teaching pastors are in this room. Not to mention, it was the end of the internship, so they invited all the interns in this room as well to kind of show off how we do this. We even invited some special guests that day. I mean, it was kind of a full room. And so I preached my message. And when I was done, I knew it didn't go so well. And so I walked out of the room. I was like, but they don't know. And I noticed it took them longer than normal to deliberate on my message. And they called me back in, and I'm like, well, either way, I'm just going to get 2 things I need to tweak, and we'll move on. And they said, Tom, today we're going to do something a little different. They said, we would like you to rewrite your entire sermon. Oh, okay. I said, well, does that mean you didn't like it? They're like, well, there was this one part we kind of liked. And we think you should just keep that part and maybe build around that part. Like, oh, okay, well, doesn't that mean I got to change my topic? They're like, oh, yeah, you need to change your topic. I said, okay, well, that text that I'd studied for months and I'm real excited about, it's going to be real hard to integrate that text into this new sermon idea. And Kurt Parker just looked me in the eye and goes, you and I both know it's the wrong text. At that point, my head just kind of went down. And Kurt said these beautiful words. He said, now don't get discouraged. And I was like, too late, buddy. And I walked out of that room with my head down. I just went straight to my car. I started driving. I called my wife. I was like, Erica, I don't know when I'm coming home tonight. I don't even know where I'm driving to. And I started telling her what had happened. We all make mistakes. And it's who we decide to be after the mistake that defines us. And I told my wife, I said, I know who I want to be. It's just not who I am right now. And I think there's some things that I'm learning. I think there's some things we all can learn. I think there's some things that David learned of what we can do when we make a mistake. If we want, when we decide who do we want to be, well, then we have to ask the question, well, what do you want to do then when you make a mistake? And I think there's some things we can learn from David's story this morning. In 1 Chronicles chapter 21, verse 8, it says, "Then David said to God, I have sinned by taking this census. Please forgive my guilt for doing this foolish thing." You see, I think the first thing we need to do when we make a mistake is simply give our mistake a name. Call it what it is. And for David, he goes, this is my sin, this is my foolish thing. That's its name. And what happens, there's a couple things that inherently happen if you're willing to give your mistake a name. One is it forces you to own it. This is my mistake. Satan didn't make me do it. No one else put me up to this. This is my foolish thing, my mess. Forces us to own it. The other thing, when we give it a name, it forces us to share that name, to confess it. The point of giving it a name is to be able to tell somebody else what that name is. And you see, the temptation is to act, well, and hope that nobody knows you messed up. No one else knows, and so you don't have to tell anybody. But if you give it a name, then you got to share that name. Hey, I know you didn't know this, but I messed up the other day. I made a mistake. I sinned. You see, the temptation is to just take our mess and clean it up. But the problem when you take a mess and you clean it up is it often gets messier. I was in middle school when my parents decided to take a little risk on me. I have 3 younger sisters, and for one night they said, you're going to babysit your younger sisters. We're going to go out on a date night. I was like, no problem, got this. And so they go out on their date, and I'm the man of the house, and it was a cold winter's night, and we had a fireplace, and I decided, well, I'm going to make a fire, because that's what a man would do, right? And so I knew my parents probably wouldn't approve of me making a fire while they were gone, or probably while they were there, either one. And but it didn't matter. I knew how to make fires. So I made a good fire. Just for the record, it was a rip-roaring fire in the fireplace. It was great. And I let it die out. The problem was my parents would be coming home soon. And so I knew I made a decent decision, but I didn't want them to know the decision I'd made, so I needed to kind of cover my tracks. And so I went ahead, I grabbed one of those plastic garbage bags and a plastic dustpan. You guys have done this? You done? Okay. No. All right. So anyway, so I go in, there's the ash, no fire, it's ash. And so I scoop out, the ash, and I quickly clean it up, and I get it all out of the fireplace. And by the time I'm done, I notice that the dustpan is no longer a dustpan, it's just a handle. It has melted. Like, oh, that can't be good. Well, I need to get this stuff out of the house. And so the bag's on the hearth of the fireplace, and I lift it up, and all of a sudden, it's like spewing out little holes that have been burnt through with the hot ash, and it's spewing out past the hearth and onto the carpet that my parents had just bought like a month before. And I'm watching these little piles of ash melt into the carpet. And so I do what I can only think of. I grab the vacuum, and plug it in, and I start vacuuming up this hot ash, and I'm watching the vacuum melt before my very eyes. And then I hear the front door open up. My parents are home. I turn off the vacuum. I go to the front door, and I just go, I did a bad thing. When we try to clean up a mess, it often just gets messier. But if we're willing to just call it what it is, to give it a name and we confess it, well, then it sets us up for the next thing that can happen, and that's the opportunity to learn from it. You see, I'm learning over and over that people who are more successful in life make more mistakes. They just learn from those mistakes. And they use them as learning opportunities so they don't make bigger mistakes. They use them as educational pieces. And so they become more successful. And so for David, he's got some things he's got to decide because God sends one of David's friends named Gad back over to David, which I just think is cool that David he's got a small group of guys, by the way. He's got Joab, he's got Gad, he's got these guys who are willing to risk their life to speak truth to the king. And even when he doesn't listen to them, they're still there in the midst of his mess. And Gad says, hey, the Lord gave me a message for you, David. There's going to be a consequence for your sin, and you can choose what it is. You can either have 3 years of famine in the land, or you can have 3 months of war, but you're going to lose every battle. Or you can have 3 days of sickness and plague in the land of Israel. And so you need to choose. And one of the things I think is interesting is David does not argue the punishment. It's not like our kids, like, really, do I have to know? He doesn't even go there. David knows there's consequence and punishment for our mistakes. And he probably knows this too because God, in several passages of Scripture way before, God says, hey, Israel and kings, if you go this way, if you don't listen to me, you're going to invite famine, plague, and war into your land. So God's already warned like a good parent. And so David has a decision to make, and this is what he says to Gad. He says, I am in a desperate situation, but let me fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is great. In other words, David's going, I don't want to fall into the hands of my enemies. I don't want them to be able to gloat or boast. I'm going to trust my punishment in the only parent I have, and that's you, Father. And I'll pray and I'll hope for mercy. And it says, so the Lord sent a plague upon Israel, and 70,000 people died as a result. 70,000 people died because of one man's mistake. That's 1 in 20 Israelites. Death is a hard pill to swallow. I know it's a hard pill for us to swallow, and sometimes I wonder, you've got God who can see beyond life and death. He can see the bigger picture of things. How hard is death? How hard a pill is it to swallow for God? And in this case, it was big enough, so much that God turned to the death angel and he said, stop, that's enough. In fact, we know in the text that God said this plague would happen for 3 days, but God stopped it after 9 hours. And I know it's hard to see sometimes in the midst of the consequence, in the midst of the punishment, but our God is still a merciful God. So God stops the plague. So what does David do? It says, David and the elders, they clothed themselves in sackcloth, they fell face down, and David said to God, was it not I who ordered the fighting men to be counted? I, the shepherd, have sinned and done wrong, and these are but sheep. You see, the thing that David does is the second thing I think we need to do when we make a mistake, and that is to simply grieve the loss. Grieve the loss. You see, it doesn't matter if your sin is private, it doesn't matter if it's public, there is always an effect, there is always a cost on others that is more than we know. And there's no wrong way to feel. There's nothing moral about the way we feel. It's okay to feel sad. It's okay to feel upset. Sometimes we can flip through Scripture trying to find that scriptural pain pill, but it doesn't exist. Pain hurts. The Bible, Scriptures tell us we're not alone in our pain, tell us it can be meaningful, but it doesn't take the pain away. And sometimes we're afraid to admit that we're sad and we're upset because we think if we say it out loud, then somehow we'll be more sad and upset. But that's not how it works. It's actually if we say it out loud, we start to feel it less. And so there's this grieving process that is necessary. And it's okay to say, I don't like this. It's okay to say, I hate when I make a mistake. It's okay to say, my sin sucks. I hate it. It's a destroyer of my life, and the devil knows it, and he's not helping me, and it's getting worse, and I messed up. It's okay to say what it is and grieve the loss. It says, then the angel of the Lord told Gad to instruct David to go up and build an altar to the Lord. Why does David need to build an altar to the Lord? Because David needs to do what we all need to do when we make a mistake, and that is get right with God. Get right with God. I know sometimes when we make a mistake, we feel like God is distant from us, but it's not like he moved. Right? God's like, I'm right here with you. You're like, great, God, I'm going over this way. And God says, I'll be waiting when you're ready to come back. I called my wife. I said, I don't know where I'm going. I don't know how long it's going to take me to get over the fact that I have to rewrite my whole message and that I don't probably have the time to do it. I don't know. I'm dealing with that. I said, what I do know is that before I can fix anything, I have to get right with God. I know that right now, I've got so much pride in myself right now that it's in the way of what could be a good message. And I got to deal with that, and there's only one person I know to deal that with, and I need to pray to him. And I don't even know where I'm driving. I just know we got to figure this out before we can move forward. I got to get right with God. And David's got to build an altar to God to get right with God. Well, we know that David goes to this high point. He knows where he needs to build his altar. There's a high point in the city of Jerusalem. There's this wheat threshing floor. This guy named Araunah, he owns it. He's out there threshing wheat. David approaches Araunah and says, hey, Araunah, I need to buy your threshing floor. I need to buy the land around it. I need to buy materials to build an altar. And I need to buy some oxen to sacrifice on that altar. And Araunah just looks at David. He's like, David, you're king. You don't have to buy a thing. You can just have it all. Take whatever you need. And David says, no, Araunah. He says, I insist on buying it for the full price. I will not take what is yours and give it to the Lord. I will not present burnt offerings that have cost me nothing. Why? Because even David knows when we make a mistake, we have to be the ones to go and make it right. David didn't send his servants to go build an altar or to go pay the price. No, David, he has to go. He has to go and do whatever it takes to try and make this right. He has to build it. He has to sacrifice. He has to pay the price. And for David, it cost him 600 gold shekels, which scholars argue back and forth. It was somewhere between $500,000 to $2 million it cost David on this mistake. And David's got to make the sacrifice. And he does. And the text tells us that fire comes from heaven and absorbs the sacrifice upon the altar. And David continues to sacrifice. Why? Not because he has to make peace with God anymore. God has accepted it. Even though the price for the sin was more than David could afford, God met him there and showed mercy on him and took up that sacrifice. So David continues to sacrifice, not to make a peace offering, but it's a praise offering. God has paid the rest for my sin. And David allows something to happen that I think each one of us need to be ready to let happen when we make a mistake. You see, David allowed this to be written down so that we could read about it and we could learn from it. You see, when you make a mistake, you need to use it to guide others, to guide other people with your story so they can learn. And yeah, that means going back through it where you may have to cry a little, you may cheer a little, sometimes you may laugh a little. On Thursday afternoon, Kurt and the rest of the teaching pastors were nice enough to come back and give me a second chance before I had to preach on Sunday and listen to the new sermon. And when I was done, they said, don't change a thing. In fact, they started celebrating and Kurt's like, this is great. This is like a team effort. He says, I feel like we've just given birth. And I told Kurt, I said, you were at the birth, but I'm the only one sweating. I'm the only. And, But you got to decide today, not who you are and the mistakes you made, but who do you want to be after you've made the mistake? Because that defines who you are. You see, we're all in a similar mess. We're all in that same mess where we've made mistakes and the cost of the cleanup is more than we can afford. We're all in that situation. We've all made mistakes and we're going to make mistakes. But who do we want to be in the mess? Who do we want to bring those mistakes to? You see, the great thing about Jesus is that through Jesus, we can bring our mistakes to God. And when you're willing to bring a mistake to God, He could take that mistake and He could turn it into a reason to celebrate. You see, this is what happened. God took that land that David bought to pay for this mistake, and that land was passed on to his son Solomon. And Solomon took that land, and he used it. It was called Mount Moriah, and he used it to build the temple of the Lord there in Jerusalem. And the temple of the Lord was built, this huge building, and God's glory and dwelling existed within that building where God would be with His people. And because they built that temple with the land that David had to pay for because of his mistake, then it ushered in the age of the Messiah. And Jesus came down and He preached some of the best scriptures that we use today from the steps of that temple and in the courts of that temple. And the Messiah did His ministry throughout that temple that was built on the land that was from David's mistake. And it was on the day of Pentecost that the Holy Spirit showed up in the courts of that temple. And God birthed His church. If you look at it, we wouldn't even be here today if it wasn't for what God did with David's mistake. He built a temple for His presence. He brought a Messiah in Jesus that we could connect with. And He gave us a church with David's mistake. If God could do something great with David's mistake, what could He do with yours?
Hi, we hope you enjoyed the message. If you'd like to give back to the church, go to harborsidechurch.org/give or text Harborside to 77977. Have a great day.